Now let's turn to Canadian cities. Canada is defined, its distinctive form of housing is this high-rise slab apartment building in the suburbs. Canada has more of those than any other country. It is the only country where it is the distinctive, unique form of housing. In Toronto alone, there are 2,000 buildings like this, the suburban high-rise, and very few other countries have built them. France has a bunch of them, but they're all public sector social housing units. These are all private sector for rent apartments. People like living in them, but there's a great many of them. And now build these tower block districts, slab farms as people call them, are the biggest recipient area for new immigration in Canada. They're where people arrive. And again, you have the same problems. Huge empty spaces between buildings, no places to create businesses and so on. Long distance commutes by slow transportation methods to work. Neighborhoods built for people who own cars, now occupied by people who perhaps can't afford a car. And no customers around to shop in your business. And something interesting happened in Toronto during the last couple of years, which is that an initiative known as Tower Renewal really took off. And last year, despite the interesting mayor, was passed in council as a new zoning thing, which was a new zoning formula which allows the building of intensified stuff between these buildings, in the areas between, so that you have higher density of housing, you have fairly loosely regulated ranges of shops and businesses and restaurants and so on, so that some of these isolated towers can become dense districts with the largely immigrant communities in them, can create a souk in between, a market situation that can ideally attract people. That first of all allows it to have the type of population density that would make higher speed transit make sense, that would make planners say, okay, there's enough people living in this tower block area now that the tower renewals happened, that it makes sense at least to put in a high speed bus line and LRT, and maybe even consider a subway hub at some point in the future, and that sort of thing. It creates enough density of people that people want to go there and go to the restaurants and so on. This is not a minor factor. I mean, some of the areas of northern Scarborough and Toronto that became this sort of form of one-story building mini mall urbanization are now the places where everyone downtown goes because they know the best Chinese restaurants are there and that sort of thing. These incentives can work very well. So that is one initiative, is to turn around the low-density outskirts places and turn them into high-density outskirts places and new hubs. And we're starting to see that kind of thinking as well. Another place in Toronto, Thorncliffe Park, much studied high-rise apartment district in the inner suburbs that was able to turn around its fortunes because it recognized that it was an arrival city, a purely rental apartment area that had been the bottom rung on the ladder, the stepping stone neighborhood for generations of immigrants from all parts of Europe and Asia and Africa and so on, now mainly people from the Indian subcontinent, that was run by a community association that recognized that it is mainly a place for new immigrants and that it needed the things for that. It introduced high-speed transit services and all that sort of stuff to make it easier for people to get to work. It convinced the transit authorities to do that. But it also created a whole lot of services. It created a special school designed for the type of technical knowledge that people on the upwardly mobile, poor immigrant trajectory need. It created a special supermarket within its confines that is a training supermarket. It entirely exists to train people management skills, accounting skills, shop management skills, and that sort of thing within it. And it's allowed the place to be quite an optimistic platform for success. Its poverty rate often seems to stay the same, but what that indicates is that a lot of people are moving through it into more middle-class districts and allowing the apartments to open up for new people from poor places and so on. You need to scrutinize economic statistics carefully because a stable or even increasing poverty rate can actually be an indication of success in an arrival city if it's channeling people through it at a fairly high rate. I'm going to close with a few lessons learned from one arrival city district that I looked at for a long time, which was in Antwerp, Belgium. The mayor invited me to spend some time looking at a district there called the 2060 that was a poor immigrant district that had become controversial in the news. Gangs, extremism, drug dealers, all that sort of stuff. And I'd wanted to look as a journalistic project at it, and so he gave me access to all its resources and all its statistics and social workers, and let me live there for a couple months and get to know it and find out what was happening. And I came up with a few, from listening to the people who live there and their ambitions, and finding out what had blocked their ambitions. I learned a few lessons for how to turn places around, because what this place reminded me of was the neighborhoods of East London that I spent a lot of time avoiding when I lived in London in the 1980s, Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and so on, because they were dangerous places full of gangs and extreme poverty and extremists and battles between different kinds of extremists and what seemed to be a downward decline for the largely Bangladeshi population there. And then when I lived in London again, 25 years later, I found myself spending all my time there and having lunch there and so on, because that same community had turned around and had become actually more successful educationally than the pale-faced English people of Britain and so on, and had achieved economic and educational success through a combination of small business success and state intervention and so on. And I realized it was the same form of housing in basically the same area, and that this European city was in basically the same place as far as being stuck that British district had been 25 or 30 years before. And I looked at what had turned the one around and what had left the other stuck. And I spent time talking to people who lived there. And a number of lessons, one of which is that urban authorities should look at the chaos of the arrival city district as an asset and not as a liability. Do what they did in that part of East London with Brick Lane, and stop making it a chaotic, messy, smelly place you're ashamed of, and make it the place that you advertise and you attract people to go to lunch there. Some of the Latin American districts outside of Washington have done the same thing, have said, here, come here, we've got poor Mexican immigrants, they have 30 kinds of food, you should eat that, and interesting festivals and that sort of thing. Advertise it. Is there poor immigrant shopping and eating street with no signs in English? Then put up signs announcing that fact, put it all over the city, and create easy access to it by roads and so on. Tell people, here, come in here, don't hide these districts, promote them. I'm always amazed at how many cities try to warn people away from districts like this instead of trying to advertise them into it. I don't need to tell anyone in Vancouver this. Listen to the people who live in these districts. And this will disappoint many people in design and planning. Often, if you actually ask the poor immigrants who are moving into districts like that what their priorities are, you might like them to be a nice park or public square or something like that. 90% of the time, the first thing they say is security. They would like to have a nice police station, not a nice park. Ideally one that they have some control over, and if they have some control over it, most of the time they'll want it to be a stricter form of policing than would be developed and so on. They want their kids to be marched back to school if they're not in class and so on. And if they do want a park, it might be one that is much more a place that you use for festivals and activities and religious purposes and so on, than one that just looks nice and has green things in it and so on. So listen to the people. And finally, if you're working at resurrecting a failed district, don't look at designing it so that it will be raised up to the level of the existing middle-class districts in the city around you. That won't work. You need to design it so that it's a much higher level than the middle-class districts around you, a much higher level of quality, a much higher level of institutions. One of the reasons why those East London districts turned around their success and created a generation who were among the most successful people in Britain was that there were initiatives to put in schools there that there was an understanding that poor immigrant districts tend to suffer a downward spiral of educational success, where The people who are educationally successful from the immigrant backgrounds tend to send their kids out of the district into more middle-class districts. The better teachers tend to go into there, and it just keeps getting worse and worse. The next generation sees that and even further gets their kids away, so you end up with a spiral of failure in schools. And there was an understanding in the 90s that the way you interrupt that is by creating a school that is well above the level of schools, even in wealthy districts, so that the poor immigrant kids in that district need to compete with the established middle class in order to get access to their own school, that they might not even be able to gain admission to their own secondary school unless they try very hard. So you shift from a downward spiral where people are competing to drop out of school at 16 or whatever the minimum legal age is, to a situation where people are competing to get into their own school. And you repeat that idea across all sorts of institutions and so on. Don't just design up to get things up to the city's level, but the most deprived districts should be designed up to a level far above the rest of the city's level, so that people will stop competing to get out of that district and will start competing to get into it. You want to get the yuppies to move in, because urban districts, there's no steady state in urban districts. Nothing stays the same. Things are either on a pattern of incline and improvement, or they're on a pattern of decline. And you want to create one other than the other, because the people who've moved into these districts have that dotted line in their minds. They see their neighborhood and their district and their own families and their futures as having that upward trajectory of success and social mobility. And the least we can do is use our intelligence to create places that match that upward trajectory, that follow their dotted line. And that is the challenge we'll face over the next 50 years as we apply our skills rather than just our luck to the next generation of urban newcomers. Thank you very much.